Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah. Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
You've tuned into Inspire FM and you're now listening to the Quranic Reflection Show with your host Amar Faz, and as always I'm here with Shaykh Noorud-deen Rashid today. Inshallah, today we're going to be speaking about something what I find quite interesting anyway, as a development as a development of attitudes amongst some people, where you hear, or you may have heard from time to time and from some people, how the word hijab isn't actually mentioned in the Quran in the way of prescribing a particular dress or a covering upon anybody. So why do we have to abide by this? You know, what's the importance of this? Some people may say this was made up by people after, and this is made up by the scholars or the quote unquote mullahs who are just trying to impose stuff on us and restrict us in the West, and basically are trying to make us all backward. So just starting with this, could you just try and explain to us, you know, maybe where this kind of thought has come from, and then after that, what does, if there is anything that does allude to hijab and the development of this term as we see it today.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Rabbi yassir wa in ya kareem. Okay, so I'll just begin with the verse of Quran and then we'll go into that inshallah. So we'll begin with Surah Nur, ayah number 31, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُنَّ وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ ولا يبدين زينتهن إلا لبعولتهن وآبائهن. And the ayah continues. Okay, let's translate it first. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, say to the believing women to lower their gaze and to protect their chastity, and not to make apparent not to expose their beauty except that which is apparent of it, and tell them to bring down their khumur, and this is the word we're going to focus on. I'll leave it untranslated for a moment. Bring down their khumur over their garments, okay, and not to expose their beauty except to their spouses and their fathers, and then the ayah continues with a list of mahram relatives. Okay,
Yep.
So we'll come shortly to the word khumur, but let's answer the question initially. This is something very important. It's a basic concept that we should be aware of, or a basic problem that we should be aware of. It's not only amongst Muslims, amongst people of most religions, if not all major religions.
Yep.
There is a tendency in most major religions, and a number of people of them, that whenever culture changes,
Yeah.
they want to change a religion to suit the culture.
Yeah.
And this is a fundamental mistake. Why? Because the whole purpose of deen and religion is to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to follow the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala,
Yep.
and not primarily, not everything in deen is contrary to culture and custom and such. Not everything, but some things are. And that's the point. When the Prophet said that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam came, there were many things in that culture that were wrong.
Yeah.
The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam didn't say, okay, well, it's the culture, let's make it fit somehow. No, he didn't, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Where there was no room, the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was clear and direct. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, irrespective of how much opposition it caused, he fought against it. Idol worship, okay, this was, they very dear to them, the kuffar and Quraysh, especially because it was the way of their forefathers.
Yeah.
It was very dear to them, and but the Prophet ﷺ was commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, opposed it head on. Okay, many other things that were, very dear to them, they enjoyed, they liked, they regarded very highly. The Prophet ﷺ imposed them head on. Okay, other things in that culture, there's no command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't say this is prohibited, this is wrong. The Prophet ﷺ accepted it. Okay, but that's the point. When the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are clear regarding something, then we shouldn't incline towards this. We shouldn't try to change the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reinterpret the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the primary purpose of trying to fit in with culture.
Make it fit,
Yeah. We, whenever we interpret Quran and Hadith, we always have to try to be sincere to it. And we have to know, we have to know the rules and regulations with regards to interpreting the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not a small matter. With the Quran, it's not permitted. Other religions may be different. In Islam, it's not permitted for any person that reads the Quran in any language to get up and say, oh, I think it means this, or I think it means that. It's not permitted. Person who wants to comment on the Quran needs to be suitably educated. Okay? Some people say, oh, this is just the scholars or the shaykhs or the mullahs just restricting people. No, it's not. It's common sense. Okay? You can't speak about anything in this life unless that you have actual knowledge about it. To speak out of ignorance, every individual is going to recognize that's a problem. Okay? And the most important thing as far as we're concerned as Muslims is the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you can't speak about medical matters without sufficient knowledge, can't speak about economic matters, can't speak about this, can't speak about that without sufficient knowledge, it's wrong to do so. The book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even more so. Okay? So people who say, oh, these are the scholars trying to restrict it, become a scholar. Study. Devote some time, devote some years, learn the Arabic language to begin with. If you want to speak about Quran, you should have some knowledge of the Arabic language. Learn the Arabic language, inshaAllah ta'ala. Study tafasir of the Quran, study hadith, study those sciences that help to understand the Quran, and you interpret it. If you feel the scholars have got it wrong, you take the path, inshaAllah ta'ala, understand the ways and means of interpreting the Holy Quran, and then you do it yourself. One thing that's really important, this is from the principles of tafsir of the Holy Quran, that what we say is the best interpreter of the Quran is the Quran itself.
The Quran,
Okay? Then after that, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Nobody can come to the Quran and say, I know what it means better than what Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ is. That's absurd. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and you're going to tell us you understand it better. That's just absurd. Okay. Also, first Quran, then Hadith, then, now this is important. Okay. After that, the people who understand the Quran best are those who were there and present at the time of the Quran, the revelation of the Quran, whose language the Quran was revealed in, okay, and who understood the context in which it was revealed in. This is why scholars of tafsir, they will always follow this path. Okay? They will, if the Quran is interpreted elsewhere in the Quran, they're going to say that this is the strongest interpretation. Okay? If it's not, but it's interpreted in hadith, that's the strongest interpretation. Okay? If it's not interpreted in Quran or explained in Quran or in hadith, they will go to the Sahaba. Okay, especially those Sahaba, all Sahaba, but especially those Sahaba who were well known for their skill in interpreting the Quran. Now, especially for example, just one example, they regard Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, his tafsir, they regard it very highly. Why they regard it very highly? Oh, because they're biased towards him? No, because the Prophet ﷺ told us when he in the dua, the Prophet ﷺ made dua in sound hadith for Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa 'allimhu at-ta'wil. Oh Allah, grant him deep understanding of the religion and grant him knowledge of interpretation. Yani this is why Sahaba used to look to this Mubarak Sahabi. So this is important. Yani somebody to come, 1400 plus years later and say, I understand it better than the Sahaba, it makes no sense whatsoever. Okay? The point is, when the Sahaba are silent regarding an aspect of the Holy Quran,
Yeah.
and there's no ayah of Quran, no hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and somebody comes and suggests a meaning, khair inshallah ta'ala.
Yeah.
Okay, but when you've got verses of the Quran like with hijab, okay, and the scholar is very clear about what they mean, and the interpretation here is very, very clear. Okay, and then for somebody to come now and say, no, I don't mean that, it means this. Well, where are you getting that from? What's your evidence? What you're using to support that? These are just theories in your mind. Show us where the evidence is.
Sure.
You see. So, going back to the original point, this is something we have to be very careful of. We all do it. We have to be honest with ourselves. We all do it. We all try to adjust the deen to try to make it fit the culture. Okay. People in the Middle East, in the Arab lands, they will sometimes do it. Okay, certain aspects, so because it's their norm and their culture to practice things in a particular way, they'll try to say, oh yeah, this is justified indeed. Okay, people in the subcontinent do it. Okay, and we're quite familiar with that because we have roots there. Okay, certain things which are clearly contrary to Islam, but because it's their culture and there's kind of norms there regarding it, it's okay, and they'll try to justify it in one way or another. Okay, and people all over the world, they will do so. Okay, and we have to be careful. Yes, fine, for most of us born and raised in this country, we're not going to start interpreting Quran and Hadith to fit with subcontinent culture, but we will, if we're not careful, start interpreting Quran and Hadith to fit with our culture here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And this is very, very important. And that's dishonest. It's dishonest wherever it happens. We interpret Quran and Hadith not to make it fit within any culture. We interpret it to try to get an honest understanding of what does this actually mean. Okay? And this is why in all of the Islamic sciences, you have a framework, you have ways, you have means which are agreed upon as valid ways of practicing and interpreting, and those which are invalid. And they're certainly invalid. That somebody, 1400 years later starts to say, oh, this word doesn't mean this, it means this. Show us where you got that from. Because the ulama, from the earliest of times, from the Sahaba on, have understood it in this way.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of culture, I understand where you're coming from in that we don't try and make the religion fit the culture around us. But at the same time, as we see throughout history, religion has never gone to a place and kind of completely wiped out the culture and said, that's it, your culture is completely irrelevant. Now, where it's not in contradiction with the deen, where the deen gives us room, and it gives us a lot of room. Yeah, I mean, I guess culture's fine there,
Yeah, of course, no doubt. When culture is not in contradiction with Quran and Hadith, fine, no problem, inshallah ta'ala. As you go throughout the Muslim lands, and even non-Muslim lands where Muslims are, many aspects of what they do and what they practice in their daily life differs. Okay? And much of that we've got no issue with. Of course we've got no issue with. We're not saying, every Muslim throughout the world should have the exact same daily routine, exact same practice, eat the same, drink the same. You see, as you said, there's a lot of flexibility, alhamdulillah. Where there's flexibility and the deen doesn't, oppose this aspect of your culture, bismillah, do what you like. Okay? Where it does, then don't try to change the deen.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to go back to the ayah that you mentioned. You said you were going to come back to the word khumur.
Yeah. So, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ. Okay. Ibn Kathir, for example, is one of our great mufassirin. He, when he came to this word, what does he say? He said, khumur is the plural of khimar. Khimar with a kha. Some listeners may know Arabic language a little, some Arabic. Okay, so obviously I'm not saying khimar with a ha. Okay, that means something completely different. But this is khimar with a kha. Khimar. Okay. So what does this word mean? Well, he explained it. He said, khumur is the plural of khimar with a kha. وَهُوَ مَا يُخَمَّرُ بِهِ أَيْ يُغَطَّى بِهِ الرَّأْسُ. Okay, he said that's the khimar is something you use to perform the action of takhmir. Okay, and then he explained what does takhmir mean. Okay, he said يُغَطَّى بِهِ الرَّأْسُ. He said it means to cover the head. Okay, so this is the point. Very, very clear. And anybody who's familiar with Ibn Kathir and his tafsir, where does he get his tafsir from? Just exactly what every traditional scholar does. Yani they try to take it back to the Quran or the Hadith or the Sahaba or the Tabi'een, because especially when it comes to matters of language and understanding words, okay, the earlier generations are going to understand it much better. Okay, because words, they change over time. And this is why, alhamdulillah, very early on in Islam, they started to write dictionaries, started to write tafasir, started to preserve these words. That this word means this at this particular point in time. This is the meaning of it. They preserved the words and the usage of those words and the connotations of those words from the era of revelation. So this is very, very important, because Ibn Kathir, subhanallah, later on, he carries on and he says, وَهِيَ الَّتِي تُسَمِّيهَا النَّاسِ الْمَقَانِعِ. Okay, so even in his time, in Ibn Kathir's time, people have changed the name. Just like in our time, we've changed it. We don't call it khimar anymore, we call it hijab. Okay, that's what we tend to call it in our cultures. Much of the Muslim world, they tend to call it hijab. Okay, so Ibn Kathir, what's he saying? He's saying, oh, in our time, this khimar or khumur are known as maqani'. What does that mean? This is a really important point, that in his time it was known by another name, different to the Quranic word used for it. Okay, and in our time it's used by another. At different times and places, people will describe the same garment in different ways. Like, for example, the garment, a lot of brothers wear what we tend to consider to be, traditional Islamic garments, the long thobe, if you like. Okay, nowadays they call it jubba, they call it this, they call it that, have different names for it. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it's called qamis. Okay, from time to time, place to place, different words are used for the same, in this case, item of clothing. So here. So anybody who says, oh, the headscarf is not mentioned in the Quran has not understood this verse. Okay? We'll ask this person, what does khumur mean? Okay? Khumur, he explained, this means a covering on the head. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they should take their khumur, these scarves that they wear on their head, or this garment they wear on their head, okay? وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. What's the jayb? The jayb is the part of the garment that a person wears, the neck opening of the garment. Okay, the opening of the garment at the neck. This is what's called the jayb. Okay, so what's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling them? The women, what should they do? The garment that they're wearing on their head, bring it down to this chest area here. Okay, right? Because how do they explain it? They say that prior to this command, women generally in that culture, what would they do? They'd wear, like a shirt or a long shirt or something along those lines. Okay, and they'd have, an opening for the neck. Okay, might be a little bit loose, may not be, maybe a little bit loose. Okay, and then they would wear something on their head. Okay, so what were they told to do? They were told to bring that down so it covers all of this area, meaning covers the ears and the neck, and going all the way down to the chest. It covers it up completely. Okay, and also what supports this is just what's mentioned just before it. Okay, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. And they should not expose their beauty or their adornment except for what what is apparent of it. Once again, we will go to the scholars of tafsir. Imam al-Tabarani, he mentions that Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, Ma ظهر minha. What does that mean? The hands and the face. Okay, so even before any mention of khumur, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told the believing women, don't expose any part of your bodies except ma ظهر minha, except that, what's apparent of it. And in Ibn Abbas, what does he explain? What's apparent of it? The hands and the face. Not the head, not the ears, not the neck, not the upper chest, none of that. That needs to be covered. So you have two clear evidences in this verse of the Holy Quran, which explains to us that the entire body has to be covered except for the hands and the face. And this is also clarified in a hadith which is Hasan li ghayrihi. For those who are familiar with the hadith science, this is a strong hadith in Abu Dawood, hadith number 4104, where it is mentioned that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned home, and Sayyidah Aisha was with her sister Asma with Abu Bakr, these are half sisters radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. Okay, alayha thiyabun riqaq, and she had clothes on that were weren't covering her up very well. May have been see-through or may have stuck to the body or what have you. Riqaq. Meaning that, it's not really covering it properly. So it's either, as I said, stuck to the body or somehow see-through it in certain parts. فَأَعْرَضَ عَنْهَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned away. Okay, why? Because she's not mahram to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sister-in-law is not mahram. Okay, so and then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, يا أسماء إن المرأة إذا بلغت المحيض لم تصلح أن يرى منها إلا هذا وهذا وأشار إلى وجهه وكفيه. Okay, again, further clarified. This is what you say. You use Quran, you use Hadith, you use the statements of the Sahaba to understand what the verse means. So here you have Hadith. Here the Prophet ﷺ said, "Oh Asma, when a woman begins to menstruate, meaning when she becomes baligha, when she becomes legally responsible in Islam, it is not appropriate that anything of her should be seen or visible except this and this." Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ pointed to his Mubarak face and hands. So this is what the ulama said. The ulama, they said that the entire body must be covered up except for the hands and the face. And then they have a long discussion which we're not going to go into today. Does it sometimes become obligatory to even cover the face, or is it never obligatory to cover the face? That's another discussion. But today we're speaking about the head covering itself.
I just want to touch on the topic of urf. We mentioned it briefly at the start, and how sorry, I should clarify what urf means. The culture of the time you're living in, and how that doesn't determine the religious rulings. Rather, it's the interpretation of the early generations. Well, firstly and foremostly of the Quran, for the Quran itself, and then the Hadith, and then what the Sahaba had to say about it, and the early generations. I mean, obviously there's a lot of pressure in some areas, especially in terms of an Islamic dress for women, to stop wearing it. I mean, what advice would you give to them, kind of on a practical level, more on a kind of on a spiritual level, just to remind ourselves and maybe the sisters who are struggling, whether they're in the workplace or in studying or wherever it may be.
Any first thing I would say is important in this situation or any other situation, because from time to time, place to place, different aspects of the deen become difficult for people. Okay, there's always challenges in deen. That's the whole point of religion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He's created us to test us. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's always going to be a test, but from time to time, place to place, that test is going to differ. Okay? And as you mentioned, this is one of the difficulties nowadays. The first thing to bear in mind whenever something is practicing it in a particular society is difficult, people struggle with it. First and foremost, we must not give in to the temptation, what we're speaking about today, to start reinterpreting the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, start changing the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to suit our practices. That's the first mistake we have to be very careful of. Rather, we should try our best, inshaAllah ta'ala. We supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we take all kinds of means to try to make it easy, try to practice it, but we have to recognize that it's going to be a challenge, it's going to be difficult, but we do not start justifying our shortcomings by saying, well, maybe the Quran didn't even mean that. And too many people do this with all kinds of aspects of the deen. Okay, that when they're wrong with something, well, maybe the Quran meant this, or maybe the Quran meant this, or these scholars are just making things up. Okay, the ulama. Can ulama be wrong at times? Of course they can be wrong. Okay, but what you don't tend to find is all of the ulama uniting upon that which is falsehood. And this in a previous lecture that we spoke about, the method of study, we spoke about these matters. And the Prophet ﷺ told us that this ummah will not unite upon falsehood. Okay, even if some people go wrong and misinterpret things, others will put them right. And others will say, look, this is wrong interpretation, this is the correct interpretation. So this is really, really important for people to understand that first and foremost, don't start reinterpreting things. The Quran says what it says. The Hadith says what it says. The Deen teaches what it is. If you're struggling with something, try and try and try again. Keep trying, inshaAllah ta'ala. You fall short, make tawbah, try again. You fall short, make tawbah, try again. And inshallah, try to, arrange things, organize things in your life to try to make it as easy as possible, inshallah ta'ala. With hijab specifically, if there's a sister and all of her friends, or none of her friends, wear hijab, that's going to make it more difficult for her. Okay, she needs to think about, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, think about the company that you keep. Okay, and if she's in the company of sisters that wear hijab, no doubt it's going to be a lot easier for her. I'm not saying she needs to leave those friends and break up with those friends who don't wear hijab, but the point is, first and foremost, the most important thing for us in this life is our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before any other relationship. Okay, so get that right, work on that, and then inshallah keep in touch with those friends who may not be practicing certain aspects. I just want to mention one last thing before we end today. In Surah Ahzab, we don't have time to go through the whole ayah, but in Surah Ahzab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to command his wives and the Muslim women to wear jalabib. Okay, jalabibihinna. Okay, and this is important because again, this is kind of a misconception when it comes to hijab. The khimar is mentioned. We spoke about that ayah. Okay, in this ayah we have jilbab. Okay, what does jilbab mean? Jilbab is a garment that covers the entire body. Okay, loosely. Okay, so because you have the command of khimar and you also have the command of jilbab, this is why the ulama, when ultimately it comes to women's dress, they said the following. They said women are obliged to cover their entire bodies except for their face and their hands with loose garments. There's a point. Where did they get this from? Jilbab and khimar. Okay, mentioned in the Holy Quran, and from this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, multiple hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So it is a misunderstanding. Some people think, as long as the sister she's wearing a headscarf, it doesn't essentially matter what else she wears, as long as her skin is covered up, it doesn't really matter. No, if the clothing is very tight and revealing, then yes, this doesn't. For this, you may say, it fulfills the command of khimar. She's got something on her head and her ears covered, her neck's covered, etc. But it doesn't fulfill the command of jalabibihinna. Okay, that they should put around them their jalabib. So this is what the ulama concluded with regards to this matter, that for the Muslim woman she needs to cover her entire body with loose clothes. Okay, exactly what does loose clothes mean? That's somewhat open to discussion, if you like, but we know what it doesn't mean. Okay, a person's wearing clothes that are tight to the skin. How can you interpret that to be loose? That's not going to make any sense.
Jazakallah khair, Sidi. We're going to have to end it there. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.